Hi, this is Chase from CNC Commentaries, and today on CNC Movie Breakdowns, we are going to be talking about the film The Iron Giant. And I am joined by the one, the only, the impeccable Nando.
Hello. How you doing, Chase?
Swell. Just swell.
Good, good.
We are going to talk about this fine film.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies. I love this film. Iron Giant. It's pretty good. Won't lie. So, why don't we jump into our initial thoughts here?
Well, why don't you go first?
Alright, so, this one, I grew up with this movie. I used to have an old VHS copy of it. So I saw this film many years ago. And, I love it. It's got some pretty, deep themes in it. And I think it's just an overall really cool story and it's executed really well. Like
Deep
all,
themes like communism, right?
and death. They go hand in hand. And,
C'est la vie.
so I think all the performances are pretty good. I really love the 2D animation in this movie. I miss 2D animation.
Me too.
You know, I you know so when I rewatched this movie, I was trying to take off the nostalgia goggles and just see it how it is. And I think it was still pretty good. What about your initial thoughts, Jace?
I don't remember the first time I saw this movie, but I didn't grow up with it like you did. I've only seen this like two or three times, and I was interested to see if it would still hold up for me and if I would enjoy it as much last time I watched it, probably 2 or 3 years ago. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much I still enjoyed it, and I agree with you. I miss 2D animation so much, and I just feel like that you just get that something special with 2D animation. I feel like it's a simple story at its premise, and um, it's just a story, the classic story of a boy and his robot.
A boy and his robot.
What's not to love?
Yeah. So with that being said, why don't you give us a short synopsis before we dive on in?
Okay, synopsis. So, The Iron Giant was released in 1999 and was directed by Brad Bird. It was based on a book of the same name, and it's uh, it's about a young boy named Hogarth who finds a robot that has crash landed in their town. This is set in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, and just the boy and the robot form a kind of like a friendship together, and he kind of needs to protect the Iron Giant from like the government and certain agents, and you know just do what he can to make sure the Iron Giant ends up all right.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
I guess without further ado, should we just jump on into this?
let's dive on in.
Say domo arigato to this roboto.
Yeah. So let's do this. So this movie with uh, with it opens with the Sputnik, the USSR Sputnik satellite going around Earth, and it says Earth 1957. So we know immediately that this is taking place during pretty much the height of the Cold War. And then a meteor comes like flaming towards Earth, and it slams into an ocean. And you see this man, I don't know what he does, but he's in a boat and it's stormy, and he's trying to radio the shore, and he thinks he sees a lighthouse in the distance, but so he like drives his boat toward it, but it turns out that it's a giant metal man, and he smashes his boat and his boat sinks, but he manages to kind of drift towards the shore, and he survives. So I really,
if I was him, I'd probably, crap my pants in fear. I don't know how he managed to stay semi-calm in that instance.
so like I really like this opening scene because it kind of sets up the giant. I mean, the giant is just kind of standing there and he rams his boat into him. But I don't know. I remember watching this movie for the first time, and I remember kind of being spooked at the giant because he just like destroyed this man's boat by standing there. But yeah.
Yeah, but unintentionally though. So.
Yeah, in fact, he kind of got attacked here.
Well, I mean, if you see a giant robot just standing there, you're just gonna let it sit there and watch you?
So then we meet our main character, Hogarth Hughes.
Hogarth.
Strange name for a kid.
Yeah, I don't know how popular the name Hogarth was in the 50s, but if you named your kid that now, you'd certainly be getting some. He'd certainly get some head turns his way.
So we get. So he's walks into this diner, and the diner is pretty populated, and we see that his mom works at the diner, and he's carrying a little box, and it's got a squirrel in it.
Yeah.
And he's asking his mom if he can keep. He calls it like his friend, but his mom's like, we're trying to rent a room. Nobody wants to rent a room with the scratched up stuff. Eventually the squirrel gets loose, and then we meet my favorite character in the movie, Dean.
Yeah. Should say, Hogarth's mom, Annie, is voiced by Jennifer Aniston, and Dean is voiced by Harry Connick Jr. So it's interesting. I remember the first time seeing this, not realizing it was Jennifer Aniston, and I was like, oh, okay then.
Yeah, and so we meet Dean, and he seems like a pretty cool guy. He's got a cool jacket, nice shades.
He's hip.
He's hip.
I bet he likes art.
He's hip and cool. And eventually the squirrel makes it into Dean's pants.
Yeah, which this is probably where they got the idea for that Phineas and Ferb song, "Squirrels in My Pants."
Yeah, maybe.
But yeah, the squirrel goes underneath the table where Dean is sitting, and then Hogarth's trying to get him, and he's like, "Excuse me, sir, my squirrel," and he goes into his pants, and I mean, just like, yeah, that's kind of nuts.
Yeah. And so eventually he drops his pants and lets the squirrel out, and the squirrel causes havoc in the diner.
Which I don't know how he was able to get away with just undoing his pants in the middle of a diner.
I don't know. Yeah,
and then let alone plopping out a squirrel.
But also in this scene, we get that fisherman from the beginning of the movie, and he's talking to other fishermen, and he's like recounting his experience about how he saw this giant metal thing, and he says that he called someone from the government.
Yes.
So, the government knows. So
they're gonna be coming down to investigate.
So Hogarth goes home, and he gets a phone call from his mom, and his mom is like, "I'm working at the diner late." She's like, "Don't eat candy, and don't go to bed late,
and don't watch
scary movies."
Yeah, sci-fi.
So, uh, then we just cut to Hogarth watching a scary movie, staying up late, and eating Twinkies. You know, he's gone against his mother's wishes. And
Which
same,
I feel like we can talk about this, but like just the animation overall in this movie is so beautiful,
yeah, it's honestly really good.
and you really feel like oh, I imagine so that Brad Bird, grew up with these, 50s sci-fi serials like the Flash Gordons, etc. The thing from another planets and all that stuff, all those cheesy sci-fi type stuff. And I feel like you can feel that influence in this as well, but
Yeah.
to do it in an animated form is
So, you know, Hogarth's trying to watch a scary movie, but then something is wrong with the TV antenna. So he goes up to investigate, and he looks at it. It's kind of been chomped at. Like half of it is gone, and he sees this kind of path of destruction. You know, he sees giant footprints. He sees like some. I guess it's a tractor. It has a bite out of. He just sees things that are metallic. They have bites out of them.
yeah.
So Hogarth, he gears up. He gets his BB gun, and he starts to follow the path because he recalled the fishermen saying like, "Oh, something's here." And so, you know, he gears up. He's just following this path of destruction, and eventually he gets to a power station. And he sees a giant metal man. And, you know, the giant immediately goes to the power station, and he just starts chomping up all the metal.
Which, like, besides the fisherman from the opening scene, it's like, you gotta think, like, how has nobody else seen this guy just walking around and around?
Yeah.
But of course, the little kid will see it, but, you know. And, it makes you think, because you're like, then you put together, like, okay, the Iron Giant has been going around, eating, ate this piece of this tractor, eating these mechanical bits
Yeah.
and machinery. And, I'm just like, he's also a, me- a mechanical thing, right? He's a machine. So he's eating these machines. Is that like robotic cannibalism?
Robotic cannibalism. Now that's something you don't hear every day.
I mean, but I mean, are you like that's what it is.
I mean, I guess.
If a transformer eats a tractor, that's cannibalism. I mean, the Iron Giant is practically a transformer.
Except he doesn't transform. He's just a robot.
Yeah.
So not really, but close enough.
This is the best Transformers film I've ever seen.
So eventually the Iron Giant, he gets stuck on some like wiring, and it starts like electrocuting him. Hogarth can see that he's in pain. You know, the giant is like screaming in pain, and the Hogarth sees he's in pain, and he manages to switch off this giant switch of electricity. Like, I guess this one switch power determines whether power goes out to this entire town.
It's the motherboard.
Yeah, I don't know if that works like that, but apparently, I guess in this.
I mean, it's a small town and it's the 50s, so it's not like as much technological stuff as
Yeah,
now.
I guess. But he flips it off, and the giant like kind of just falls to the floor, and he's not really, I don't know, conscious. So Hogarth gets on top of him, and he starts like throwing rocks at him to see if he'll wake up. But
Yeah, because when in doubt, when you see a giant robot, start throwing rocks at it, because that won't piss it off.
But eventually, the giant wakes up and he leaves. And Hogarth's Hogarth's mom, Hogarth's mom eventually, like, she arrived home, and she saw that Hogarth was missing from home. So she gets out in her car and she starts looking, and eventually she finds him.
Like, why wouldn't she call the police if he was missing,
I don't
or
know.
wasn't home?
It's the 50s, man. Anything's possible.
It's the 50s, man. There could be freaking giant robots.
Nobody cares.
I suppose.
And so yeah, Hogarth tries to tell his mom about the giant robot, but she doesn't believe him, and so they just get in the car and go home.
It's like it's 100 feet tall, Mom. You
Yeah.
gotta believe me.
And we get to a class. So we cut to Hogarth in class, and something interesting about the scene is they're talking about eventually the story that the fisherman has been telling has like gotten around the town, and so his classmates are talking about it, and Hogarth's like, oh, I saw it, and then you get this, I think it's kind of cool dialogue in which some of the students are like, yeah, I bet it's made by the Russians, we need to blow it to smithereens. And you also have this video on the projector, and it's playing duck and cover in case of an atomic bomb.
Well, yeah, because this is the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, this is the Cold War, so like the Red Scare is happening. Yeah, you've got, they're like preparing kids in case of a nuclear war.
Yeah, there's like that little like, not training video, but it's like, okay, duck under the tables in an atomic explosion.
Yeah, and yeah, it's kind of like the kids are just saying like, oh, if anything is bad, it's pretty much Russian.
Yeah, when in doubt, blame it on the Russians.
Yeah. So then we're introduced to another one of my favorite characters, Agent Mansley.
Kent Mansley.
Yeah, Kent Mansley.
Probably my favorite character, just in terms of over the top actions and dialogue.
Yeah, he's got some really good dialogue scenes here. So I really like the way we're introduced to this character, because he rides up in his like official government vehicle, and we find out that he's part of the Bureau of Unexplained Phenomena. So he introduces himself, Kent Mansley, to this construction worker, I guess. I don't know, he's some guy that works at a power station. And so, he kind of introduces himself as like this super secretive and important agent. And, I think that's done really well. I think Kent Mansley thinks of himself as super secretive and important. And, so he's looking around and he sees all the destruction and like how there are metal things bitten out of, like he kind of writes it off as something else, and he says like, oh, I don't care about this, I just need to fill out my report and get back to Washington.
Because of course, what else can take giant bites out of a tractor?
And he also finds Hogarth's broken BB gun. I don't know if I don't know if we mentioned that, but earlier when Hogarth met the giant, he dropped his BB gun and the giant stepped on it.
And it has his, it has Hogarth's name on it.
Yeah, but half of the name is cut off, so I think all that's left of the name is like Hogq or something. And so he's just like talking to himself while getting back into his car, and he's saying like, oh, this town isn't worth anything. But then as he gets into this car, he finds out that half of his car has been bitten into and just eaten.
Yeah, within the course of like seconds.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then he turns around again to talk to someone, and then his car's just gone.
Yeah, I don't know. The Iron Giant can be super stealthy when he needs to be, I guess.
Very convenient stuff.
Yeah. So he's like, oh my god. And so, he runs to get the construction worker again, and then they come back and the car is just gone. And so now he's like, oh, big things are happening here.
Which, logically speaking, if I was in his shoes, I would just think, oh shit, someone stole my car.
Somebody stole my half-eaten car.
Well, I mean, if he didn't see it half-eaten the first time.
I guess then. So Hogarth goes out back into the forest, and he's got a camera with him. And he has a piece of scrap metal, and he tries to lure out the giant. And so eventually, he waits a very long time, but eventually the giant comes out, and he snaps a picture with the giant, and him and the
selfie.
Yeah, I think him and the giant have a really nice interaction. So they're sitting next to each other, and of course there's a towering giant. And Hogarth finds out that the giant can kind of understand what he's saying, but the giant can't really talk.
Yeah, he's like tree,
yeah,
rock, and it's like,
so
this is where the combination between Vin Diesel and The Rock first started,
So Hogarth, he holds up a rock, and he gets him to say rock, and he holds up, and the giant picks up like a tree, and he calls it a rock. So the giant just kind of is curious about his surroundings. You can tell that the giant is kind of he's kind of like self-aware. He knows he doesn't really know what he's doing. So eventually they talk more, and Hogarth tells the giant that he has to stay in the forest, and he can't be seen. Then
which out of all people, why does the Iron Giant decide to come out to Hogarth? Just because he's been stealthy this entire time. Either the Iron Giant's being very stealthy when he wants to be, or people aren't just paying the fuck attention.
Probably a mixture of both. I think Hogarth just managed to draw him out with some scrap metal. He just got lucky.
Well, I know, but with their first interaction at the afterwards, the second time when he's lured out, he could have, if the Iron Giant could have not taken too kindly and could have treated Hogarth a different way, a more extreme way, if you will.
Yeah, but this giant kind of doesn't want to hurt anybody. This giant.
Well, as we know, he only does if provoked.
Yeah. So we get this scene, with the Iron Giant is just following Hogarth, even though Hogarth's telling him to stay. And they reach a set of train tracks. And the Iron Giant takes a bite out of the train tracks, and he messes up the tracks. But then the lights start blinking, and they hear a train coming.
Yeah, and Hogarth is more worried about the Iron Giant himself getting his head smashed in by the train than the actual people on the train with the messed up tracks.
I don't know. I mean, the giant manages to fix the tracks pretty easily, but he manages to fix them to a manageable level. But the Iron Giant just sits there trying to perfect them even more.
Well, I mean, but if the train is coming, right, and the Iron Giant has his head right there, I feel like more damage is going to be done to the train than the Iron Giant.
Yeah, but at this point, Hogarth doesn't really know the durability of the Iron Giant.
I feel like he could assume.
So eventually, the Iron Giant manages to correct the train tracks, but he does get hit in the face with a train. So the train kind of crashes, and the Iron Giant kind of falls next to Hogarth, and some of his pieces, his limbs, fall off. But a little antenna pops out of his head, and he starts calling back all the pieces. And that'll be used later in the movie. And so all the pieces start to come back, and we cut to Mansley in the mayor's office, and I guess he's talking to the mayor about how big things are happening, this needs to be investigated. But the mayor's secretary gets a call about the train accident, and how the people are saying that the train got hit with a giant metal man. So Mansley hears this, and he's like, "Oh, that's our guy."
That's the one.
That's the one. And so Hogarth ends up escorting the Iron Giant back to the barn. He puts him in like a barn, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
barn.
we see the giant reconstruct himself. Like we see all his limbs come back together. And
Basically, I'll just plop right back into the right sockets and whatnot, and then practically good, isn't it?
yeah. And so we get a scene where Mansley's at the train crash like site, and he sees that he talks to, I guess, the train driver, one of the train workers, and he gets confirmation that it got hit by like a metal man, and so he's hot on his trail. And then we get a scene between Hogarth and his mother. They're having dinner.
I love this scene so much.
This scene's pretty funny.
So they're having dinner, Hogarth and his mother, and well, she's like, "Okay, Hogarth, would you like to say grace?" And so he's about to start, and then he just sees one of the Iron Giant's hands, like trying to get food, looking for food in the kitchen, and so he's like, "Oh God!" And then being all dramatic. And basically, his mother's like all confused. Obviously, the mother does not turn around and see a giant metallic hand in her house just going around. But anyways, Hogarth is like, "Would you excuse me for a second? I gotta go check on something." And so Hogarth has to, tell the hand. He's got to talk to the hand.
Talk to the hand.
And basically be like, "Hey, you can't be in here. Go back in the barn." And my question is, how does this hand know where to go? Does this hand have eyes? How is it just going off of touch? Because it seems very much like this can see, and that just raises so many more questions about the Iron Giant's capabilities.
Yeah. Iron Giant seems to have a lot of abilities, but they're just kind of implied. Like they're not really explained because they don't know anything because he's from outer space. But yeah, he puts the hand back in the barn and it reconnects with the Iron Giant. Why don't you walk us through our next scene, Chase?
Well, Kent shows up, and he's basically like, I'm a government agent. I ask you a few questions, all that stuff. And but meanwhile they hear a ruckus upstairs, and so Hogarth's mom and Ken Mansley go up to check, and meanwhile Hogarth's trying to get the hand. He's trying to like shove it out the window, just like go. They're in the bathroom, and then his mom opens the door, and he's acting like he's using the toilet, and he's like, "Mom, get out!" Because he's making a ruckus upstairs, like, just go. And so his mom must think he was having a pretty tough shit.
Yeah. So Ken entered their house to use their phone because he wants to call a general. Mansley uses the phone and he talks to this general. And I really like the general in this movie. He's very like curt with Mansley. So he starts making fun of Mansley. He's like, "Oh, it ate your car," and he says for him to get more evidence. So he's like, "Yeah, if you got a photograph of this thing, then I could get some troops down there."
Yeah.
So Mansley gets kind of upset. He's like, "Oh, I'll get your photo." It's just really funny, the interactions between them. And so Mansley gets in his car, and you know, as he's driving, he realizes, you know, he's making fun of Hogarth's name, and he's
Kind
like,
of like
yeah,
earlier.
he's like, oh, what a weird name for a kid. But then he leans over and he sees the initials Hog Hugh, and he's like, oh my God, Hogarth Hughes. And so, you know, he comes back and he asks him if he's seen anything suspicious.
Meanwhile, you know, we get a scene afterwards where Hogarth goes back to the barn to check on the Iron Giant. And then they have this nice moment where they go outside at night, and Hogarth is you know, being held in that palm of the Iron Giant, and they just go out in the dark. You know, they're looking at the stars and the moon, and you know, it's a nice moment between the two of them. But Hogarth is telling him, he's like, you know, you can't just be out and about um, like this. But the Iron Giant's hungry, and they see kind of like a old rusted car. He's Hogarth's like, well, I mean, I guess you can have that. But right before they're able, you know, the Iron Giant's able to, you know, grab the car and eat it. We see another car barreling down the street,
Yeah.
and would you guess who it could be?
It be Dean.
It is Dean, the cool kid, cool guy.
Yeah, he collects
And
scrap metal.
yeah, you know, he takes the car, he tows it off, and the Iron Giant just looks so sad. He's like, "Damn it, I was gonna eat that. That's my dinner."
Yeah. But before we move on, we skipped over an important scene. It's of Hogarth after that whole fiasco of Grace and Mansley coming back. Hogarth goes back to the barn with the Iron Giant, and he shows him some comic books.
Oh well, yeah, that's this whole movie. You know, it's obviously inspired by Superman.
Yeah, the story of the Iron Giant is definitely the Superman story.
I'd say this is arguably the best Superman movie of all time.
And so Hogarth shows him like a Superman comic, and he tells him about how Superman's the good guy, and how, you know, he compared the Iron Giant to Superman. You know, he came from another planet, but he helps the people. And he also has, I don't remember the name of the comic, but it's like an Iron Giant villain, Atomico, I believe. And, you know, Iron Giant looks at it, but Hogarth's like, oh, no, no, no. You can't, you know, like, Atomico's the bad guy. He's the villain. He hurts people. And, you know, you get, like, the Iron Giant is he's kind of like a child. He's very impressionable. So it's just interesting to see their dynamic.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's because it's a new surrounding.
Yeah.
But they're in this scrapyard, and you know, the Iron Giant just starts, you know,
Chomping.
chomp, starts chomping on whatever he can find. Um, uh, and it's just, you know, it's the bonding between Hogarth and the Iron Giant that makes this movie.
Yeah. I mean, you get this funny interaction where the Iron Giant is chomping down on like this old rusty car, and the horn starts going off, and Hogarth's like, "Oh, get rid of it, get rid of it." And so, you know,
He just chucks it.
yeah, first he tries to like sit on it, then he tries to beat on it, and then he just like throws it, and then like this thing is gone. So Dean, who I guess lives on the scrapyard,
Because of course he does. He's a hip guy.
yeah. So he hears this kind of commotion, and you know, he comes out, and you know, Hogarth tells the Iron Giant to hide, and you know, Hogarth just shows up at his door, and you know, Dean lets him in, and you know, they just get to talking, and we find out that Dean does art using scrap metal. And Dean offers him espresso coffee.
Espresso.
Whatever. And you know, Hogarth asks Dean if he's gonna like rat him out for sneaking out. And Dean's like, "Oh, that's not my style."
Yeah, he's cool. He
Yeah,
wouldn't do that.
he's
I
like,
make modern art, man. I drink espresso. I
I live
I
on a
wear
scrapyard.
some cool sunglasses.
Yeah. And
So basically, this is how Dean and Hogarth become pals.
yeah. And eventually, Dean, the Iron Giant, makes more commotion, and Dean walks out, and he sees the Iron Giant. And initially, he tells Hogarth to like run, but eventually, the Iron Giant catches them, and he picks up Dean. And Hogarth's like, "Oh no, Dean's my friend."
Well, yeah, because the Iron Giant was getting ready to bash Dean's head in, practically.
Yeah, he was like holding him up, giving them the stink eye.
But Hogarth's like, no, he's good. He's my friend.
Yeah. And so now Dean knows about the Iron Giant's existence, and Hogarth like asks Dean. He's like, please, let him stay here."
Just babysit him for the night.
Yeah. And so Dean just like walks back into his house, and we get this really cool like cut. Like we get this cool 37 minutes later, and then
Yeah.
this is a really odd number to cut out on. And you see Hogarth is still outside Dean's door, and he's like begging him to let him stay the night. And eventually Dean cracks.
Let the Iron Giant stay the night, not Hogarth.
Yeah, the Iron Giant stay the night. Eventually he cracks, and we see that the Iron Giant is kind of like sleeping on the scrap metal after a nice meal.
Mm-hmm.
So Hogarth comes home, and he's tired out of his mind. He's stayed up all night. He finally comes in his room just as he's about to get into bed. His mom walks in. And he's like, "Oh, you're up already."
I mean, I just want to say, like, if you were an agent like Mansley, and you were looking for this alleged robotic being, wouldn't you think to start at, like, the local scrap yards?
I mean, I don't know. I guess he could try to connect the dots and see that this guy eats metal.
Well, I mean, even if you didn't, just, like, because that would be the most natural spot for him to blend in.
I don't know. And so we find out that Mansley has rented the room in their house.
Because of course he has. It's weird. I find him like slightly creepy, but also just like too like over the top, charismatic, and just like like you said, he's like acts like he's way more important than he is, and he's just like trying to get into stuff that isn't fully like his to get into.
Yeah, I guess. And so then Hogarth gets a call from Dean, and Dean's like, "What? I said I watch him for the night, not the day. It's day. He's eating my scrap metal."
Hey, yeah, this is this great like moment where he's like, Dean is talking to the Iron Giant. He's like, hey, this right here, this is my art, man. That over there, that's scrap metal.
Yeah.
And the Iron Giant's basically just like giving him a look like, oh, what's the difference?
So Hogarth has to hang up the phone because Mansley's trying to listen in, and then we get this really cool, I don't know, like montage.
Yeah.
Of, Mansley's trying to get information out of Hogarth. So like at every turn, Mansley's
He's like, hey kid, we should swap stories. Hey,
he gives them all like
how tall was that robot?
he gives him like all these like whenever he addresses him, he's like, "Oh hey cowboy," and then "Hey scout," "Hey Spores."
Hey Bucko.
Yeah, "Hey Buckaroo."
And that's another thing I love about this movie: the dynamic between Mansley and Hogarth. They're back and forth.
Mm-hmm. So then we get to a scene in a diner between Mansley and Hogarth, and Hogarth is showing him how to add chocolate to his ice cream sundae.
This is probably my favorite scene.
And you know, Hogarth gave Mansley some laxatives in his ice cream, and so they're eating ice cream together, and Mansley is basically like trying to pressure him into revealing some information.
I mean, it's like just they're drinking milkshakes, and then he's just exploding in this kid's face, and he's just like I said, he's so over the top.
Yeah,
And then right as he's like pointing his finger at Hogarth, he just runs straight to the restroom.
yeah. He goes off on like this big, like he's like as
Tirade.
yeah, and he's like, we don't know who made it. It could be the Russians, the Chinese, I don't know, Canadians. And he's like, I don't care. What we need to do is we need to find it. We need to destroy it before it destroys us. So yeah, he's very like dramatic. And then
I mean that's his whole character.
yeah, then he runs to the bathroom because Hogarth got him with the laxatives.
That old trick.
Yeah, and so Hogarth he strides on over to the scrapyard where the Iron Giant is helping Dean make some art.
It looks like a little like mobile, and he's hanging up these cars.
Yeah. And so we get this scene of the Iron Giant and Hogarth just hanging out. Hogarth makes the Iron Giant like spin him around in a car to make it look as if he was in a rocket ship of some sort.
Yeah. And then we get this next scene, another pretty memorable scene where Hogarth, Dean, and the Iron Giant are all like by like a lake.
Yeah.
Like swimming area, and then Mansley is in the woods, and he peeks down and he sees a piece of metal just hanging, and then he sees the Iron Giant and Dean and Hogarth all just there swimming. And then Hogarth jumps into the water, and he's swimming around, and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's so much fun." And then the Iron Giant walks back and then jumps into the water. And then, of course, water is going to go everywhere, and it's practically a tsunami.
Yeah.
Just flooding the entire town. And it's, it leaves everywhere just so damp, and like the river basin is practically like half of the water floods out.
And so Dean is just stuck in his chair, and he gets washed out to the road. And he's just sitting in his chair, and then like a farmer
he's got like pigs in the back.
Yeah, a farmer drives up, and he's like, "Oh, you're in the middle of the road," and then Dean's like, "Yeah," and then the farmer's like, "You're in the middle," and then he says, "Yeah," louder, and the farmer's like, "Oh, okay," and then he drives off. So so now that Mansley has found Hogarth's camera in the forest,
he's hoping there's a photo of this giant.
So yeah, he goes into the like we cut back to the house, and he's in the bathroom, and he's developing the photos because this is the 50s and you have to do that. So he's developing the photos in the bathtub, and there's this really cool red lighting. As you like, it's just,
well, I mean that's what they had to do. They had to make a dark room to develop photos.
Really cool.
But also symbolism of the Red Scare.
Yeah.
And communism.
And so Mansley got this photo of Hogarth and the Iron Giant, and we get this really kind of, it's almost like a sad scene where Hogarth and the Iron Giant are just walking through the forest, and they see a deer.
They meet Bambi.
Yeah, so they meet a deer, and they're just kind of admiring its beauty, but then they look away for a second, and hunters shoot the deer, and then they come.
And the Iron Giant does not take kindly to that.
Yeah, the Iron Giant kind of just scares the hunters away, and they just see the deer's corpse, and
He just pokes it.
yeah, he just like you get the Iron Giant doesn't really understand the concept of death, and it's kind of sad to see him learn about death. You get these really sad lines by Hogarth about how like, oh, you know a gun is used to kill. And how about everything dies eventually. He says it's bad to kill, but it's not bad to die.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just kind of like, wow, that's a pretty deep line.
I mean, and that sets us up for the end of the movie when
Yeah.
they're shooting at the Iron Giant.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the Iron Giant, he feels this, not sadness per se, but as close as he can to a sense of sadness for this deer's death.
I guess, yeah. And so Hogarth arrives home, and it's nighttime, and he walks into the barn, but he sees that it's like pitch black. But as he tries to leave, Mansley he locks him in this barn, and he sits him down in this chair. And so Mansley knows now. He knows that the Iron Giant. So we get this like interrogation scene of this government official interrogating a literal child.
And he's flashing this bright light,
Yeah.
and trying to get a confession out of him, and it's like it's just so over the top for no reason.
So, yeah, he shows him the photograph, and that doesn't really prove anything. But then he brings up that like, oh, who are you gonna choose, the giant or your mother? And then Hogarth's like, oh, what do you mean you can't do anything? And then Mansley goes on like this really mean-spirited speech about how like, oh, raising a child as a single mother is so hard, but we can make it so much harder. Make it so hard that it would be irresponsible for her to keep you anymore. And so, knowing that, under the threat of that, Hogarth cracks and tells him that he's in the scrapyard. And then, Mansley kind of like, I guess he puts chloroform on his face. And,
yeah, he just knocks the kid out.
Yeah.
Uncalled for. Kid told him where he was.
And so...
And then he wakes back up in his room, and then there's like, there's nails on the window, so he can't go out the window.
Yeah.
And then Mansley is just watching him, so he doesn't leave.
Yeah, Mansley has already made the call to the general, and troops are going to be out in the morning. And
so it's just this staring contest back and forth with both of them in their rooms.
Yeah. So eventually, Hogarth pretends to be asleep, and then when Mansley eventually falls asleep, he puts pillows in his bed to make it look like there's some kind of form sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And in the morning, he walks past Mansley's room, and he's like, "Oh, good morning, Mr. Mansley." And so Mansley goes out, and troops start arriving at Dean's scrapyard. And Dean's just acting so like nonchalant about it, and Mansley asks him like, "Oh, where's the robot?" He's like, "Oh, he's in the back."
Yeah, he's like, and then he has this great line where he's like, "Oh, this big art collector already put in a bid on him, but hasn't been sold yet. So I guess if you really wanted him, the right price."
Yeah, you could put in a competitive bid.
Yeah, and he's basically, and it's really well done. It's really well set up, and he's basically, they show the military men and Mansley the Iron Giant, but they're passing it off as, one of his art statues.
Yeah.
And the general is not happy about this.
Yeah, so it appears that Mansley has been fooled, and so the general like screams at Mansley, and he's like,
and not necessarily fooled, like, but just like, because they could think Mansley did see a robot, but they probably think that he just didn't realize this guy was made these kinds of sculptures.
Yeah. And so yeah, general gets super angry at Mansley, and he's like, "Oh, when we get back to Washington, you're packing your things, you're out." And so eventually, the military men leave, and the Iron Giant moves again. And we get this scene where Hogarth and the Iron Giant are like they're just I guess like playing around, and Hogarth has like this toy gun, and so he points a toy gun at the Iron Giant, and it just kind of like zaps a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a toy, but the Iron Giant sees this, like his eyes like turn red, and he just kind of sees this. Yeah, he literally sees red.
Yeah, and he shoots off this like beam.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to earlier with the whole deer thing of like guns are bad or guns are used to kill.
Yeah.
But dying isn't bad.
And so he shoots his beam, but he misses Hogarth. And eventually Dean realizes what's going on, and he grabs Hogarth, and he tells the giant to run away. Like he tells the giant to go away.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's Dean is looking out for Hogarth.
Yeah.
Because he thinks the Iron Giant's like not necessarily going to intentionally hurt Hogarth, but also like the Iron Giant probably doesn't fully know what it's capable of doing.
Yeah.
And he probably doesn't want the Iron Giant to even just accidentally hurt Hogarth.
So yeah. Eventually Dean picks up Hogarth's toy gun, and he's like, "Oh, it's a defense mechanism." So the Iron Giant only attacks in self-defense. And eventually the giant's just like sulking in the snow while the military convoy is going by, and these two boys are looking at him through their binoculars, and they're kind of on a ledge.
And because of course, when you're a young child, play on a ledge, and nothing will go bad, especially in the snow.
And eventually they fall off, but the Iron Giant runs into town in front of a ton of people.
Like he just doesn't care anymore. He just goes to save, which he's prioritizing these kids' life over his own, and people seeing him.
Yeah.
Which shows how he's developed after meeting Hogarth.
Yeah. And so the military convoy is going by, and Mansley sees this giant. So he starts like freaking out, and he's in between two military vehicles, and so they both crash into him. But he's just like, look, and eventually the entire like military convoy sees this, and you even get a really good moment with the general, and he's like, "Holy sweet mother of God!"
I mean, it's this scene, and later it's very reminiscent of like King Kong. The original 30s King Kong, where you have this big creature, and then the military is basically like, what the hell is this? And they don't realize that it is actually nice, and they go after it with force rather than other means.
Yeah. And so the military just like they start unloading bullets onto this thing. Dean's telling Mansley like, "Oh, the giant only operates in self-defense. Like you need to stop shooting at it. It's got Hogarth. Like Hogarth's there with it." And so Mansley takes this, and he goes to the general, and he's like, "Oh, it killed the kid. We need to destroy the monster." And they're just trying to get everything to attack this giant. The general even radios in, and they talk to there's that scene where other generals talk to the U.S. president, and it's like, we have a situation. And so now we got fighter jets after the Iron Giant, and the Iron Giant and Hogarth are just running away, and eventually they fall off a cliff, but it turns out the Iron Giant can fly.
You can fly! You can fly!
Yeah. And you get this really awesome moment where the Iron Giant starts to fly, and then Hogarth's like, "Put your arms out like Superman," and he starts just flying around like Superman, and it's great. And eventually, he manages to evade the fire jets for a while until he's hit out of the sky, and he just falls out of the sky and he crashes into the snow. And the Iron Giant opens back up, and he sees that Hogarth is there, just laying there motionless. And so that was the last straw for the Iron Giant. He screams and his eyes turn red, and he just he gets back up and he just starts destroying the military. You see all these weapons come out of him, and he just starts the military has nothing that can hurt him.
I mean, these are practically the only people the Iron Giant has known, so it makes sense why he would care for Hogarth and them so much, especially with all that Hogarth has done for him.
Yeah, you can really feel the attachment grown between them. The Iron Giant is he's going against the military, and Dean and Hogarth's mother catch up with him, and they find out that Hogarth is just unconscious, he's not dead.
Surprisingly.
And the general gets battleships to fire on the Giant, but nothing is having an effect on them.
Until the nuke.
Yeah, so the general's like, what are we gonna do? And then Mansley's like, oh, we haven't tried everything, General. The bomb. And then, the general's like, you scare me, Mansley. And so...
Yeah, the general doesn't even want to go through with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so...
Because if they send off this nuke, it's gonna blow up the whole town.
Yeah, so Mansley's plan, I guess, is to he's oh, the Giant follows whatever attacks it, and if we lead it away from the town and then bomb it, we'll be fine. So the general was even like, you want us to bomb ourselves to kill this thing? And eventually the general's he sees no other options, so he's like, radio, and I guess the bomb is going to come from a nuclear sub. So he's called the Nautilus. He's like, radio the Nautilus and tell them to fire in my command. And Hogarth wakes up, and Dean and Hogarth's mother drive, and they're stopped by military. They're stopped by military who are still trying to fight the Giant. And the Giant's turned around, and he's looking at the battleships in the distance. And Hogarth runs out of the car, and he runs to the feet of the Giant. And the Giant looks down on him, and he points his gun at him. And Hogarth's like, remember, guns kill. You don't have to be a gun. And then he says one of the best lines in the movie. He says, you are what you choose to be.
Yeah.
And that calms the Giant down, and he puts away all his weapons.
And he picks up Hogarth.
Yeah, he picks up Hogarth. And so... Sorry, go.
The general is, they're basically ceasefire, and, they need to call off the nuke. But Mansley he doesn't want to, so he grabs hold of the radio, and he basically just says, launch.
Yeah.
Without taking a second thought to it. And then he's like, do you realize what you have just done?
Yeah, in that scene, you've got... So the general basically has to make a choice. You've got, Dean in one ear telling him, oh, the Giant only attacks when provoked. He only attacks in self-defense. And you've got Mansley saying, oh, we need to kill this thing right now. Our future's at stake. And so eventually the Iron Giant comes out of the smoke, and he sees that it's holding Hogarth with no weapons out. So the general's like, oh, stand down. And then he, radios into the Nautilus. He's like, Nautilus, do you hear me? And then Mansley, grabs the radio, and then he's like, oh yeah, launch the missile now. And so the missile has been launched. It goes up into the sky, and it's presumably going to come down and destroy everything. And, you get one of the, one of my favorite scenes in the movie, in which, the general's like, oh, we're all going to die for our country. And then Mansley's like, screw our country, and he tries to steal a car and run out, but the Iron Giant stops his car. And it just kind of shows that he's really a coward. Like, he might act all important and like he's really important and secretive, but when it comes down to it, he's not willing to sacrifice anything. He just tries to run. And so, you know, they have him, and eventually you get this really heartwarming scene between the Giant and Hogarth. And, you know, Hogarth tells him, like, oh, when that missile comes down, everybody will die. The Giant...
It's basically at this point we know that the Iron Giant is going to make the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah. And so you get this really cool callback to when Hogarth in the forest, when Hogarth was telling the Iron Giant to not follow. And the Iron Giant's like, I fix. And he like pokes at Hogarth with his finger. He's like, no following. You know, it's just really sad. You know, Hogarth's like, I love you. And then the Iron Giant just like blasts off into the sky. And you know, there's just really good music in the background. It's just super dramatic. And you know, the Iron Giant's like racing off towards this missile. He's on a collision course with it. And you know, right before he collides with the missile, he's like, Superman. And then the missile just explodes. You see this giant explosion in the sky.
I mean, it's very reminiscent of the original Superman with Christopher Reeves, where he goes around, you know, flies around the planet to, you know, reverse back time.
And then we cut to presumably some time later, and we find out that they've erected a statue in the Iron Giant's honor. It's a statue of the Iron Giant holding Hogarth in his hand. And you see now that Dean and Hogarth's mother are together, and you know, Hogarth's off playing with his friend. And eventually they'll start talking, and Dean hands Hogarth a box that has a screw of the Iron Giant. He says that it's the only part that they recovered.
Mm-hmm.
And the general thought that Hogarth should have it. And
but then, when Hogarth wakes up in the morning, the box is empty.
Yeah, Hogarth wakes up kind of like at night, and this screw is like kind of pushing itself against his window, and you hear that sound that the giant, like kind of like that ping ping noise that the Iron Giant made when it was recalling all its like lost limbs and parts earlier when he got hit by a train. And so Hogarth realizes that, oh, he's alive because he's recalling all his parts. And then we cut to somewhere in Iceland where we see a ton of Iron Giant parts like walking by themselves in the snow. And then our last shot of the movie is the Iron Giant head with the antenna poking out, calling all its body back.
And then we just close on his face.
Yeah.
And that's the movie.
That is the movie. It's like, this movie is just amazing, in my opinion. It's really good.
I agree.
So yeah, let's go into our closing thoughts here. I'll go first.
Well, overall, you know, this movie, I'm a sucker for traditional 2D animation, and this film, like, even though, like, obviously we weren't alive anywhere near the time of the 50s, this just feels very nostalgic of that time period. And, you know, it's, especially if you're, like, aware of, like, those old school 50s serials, and like got that Cold War scare, and like how that would link in with like also the sci-fi films of the day, and how that would parallel with communism. And you know, it's just, the animation is so beautiful, the relationships between Hogarth and the Giant, it's great. and I think Brad Bird does a excellent job.
Yeah. As for my closing thoughts, yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said. This movie it has some like deeper and more mature themes like death and things like that. And I just think that I find it really kind of ironic that as the movie progresses, the giant becomes more human, as opposed to characters like Mansley, who will step over others to try to accomplish his mission or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this story is just told beautifully. You know, this is not the most complex story. It's just the story of a boy and his robot. So overall, I'm gonna give my very first. I'll give this movie a 10 out of 10.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Sound the alarms.
This one's a banger for sure.
Well, I'm not gonna give it a 10, but I do enjoy this film a lot for the most part. Um, I can't really think of anything I necessarily hate about this movie. And I'd give it a solid 8 out of 10.
Nice.
Um, but wow, so far we've both each given 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
It's pretty nifty.
Well, folks, if you listen this far, we thank you for watching and listening.
You can like the video if you like the video. You can subscribe. You can do all that shit that every other person probably tells you. Let us know what you think about the movie down in the comments below. Nando, is there anything I'm forgetting?
Oh, we've got to do the teaser.
Oh yes, the tease. All right, strap in. We're in for a joy here. Next time on the show, we are going to be talking about our first Coen Brothers film. So be excited for that. And you're all probably wondering which one it could be. This one came out in 1987 and stars a pretty popular actor by the name of Nicolas Cage. Also stars Holly Hunter, and we are, of course, talking about Raising Arizona. And now, Nando, you know nothing about this movie.
I don't know a thing about this movie other than it's directed by the Coen Brothers and it's got Nicolas Cage in it.
And damn it, that's all you need to know. And I hope you like it because it's such a joy to watch.
Alright, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys later.
Buenos noches.